The beautiful Lakshadweep Islands are home to a vast amount of marine biodiversity, and our countrymen from these islands lead a life in harmony with the nature around them. But their lives are no longer isolated from the outside world. Continuously rising sea surface temperatures threaten their livelihood and their sustenance. To protect their livelihood, one must ensure that they are able to continue fishing for tuna. Now, tuna requires bait fish, and this bait fish can be ensured only if lagoons in the Lakshadweep Islands are protected. Thus began the endeavor that Dr. Deepak Apte of BNHS will narrate to us now. A Herculean task which, with the participation of the locals and a continued effort of 14 years, achieved a major milestone recently. A milestone of ensuring the notification of 685 square kilometers of Lakshadweep as a marine protected area. Let us listen to this.
I'm going to take the audience through the very interesting journey that we started in 2003. The original concept was evolved around 2002, 2003. Most of you are aware that we have very few number of marine protected areas in this country. And one of the biggest challenge to have marine protected areas is that people find it very hard to support the concept because it entails to a number of restrictions. I mean, that's what the perception is. In 2001, Government of India made amendments to Wildlife Protection Act and included two specific categories, namely conservation reserve and community reserve. Now, community reserve is the one which can be established where land ownership is with the people. It's a concept of co-management where both community and government has equal role in management of specific protected areas. Conservation reserve, on the other hand, can be established where ownership of land or water is with the government. Since there are not many marine protected areas, especially on the west coast of India, we thought it's a good opportunity to develop a model because co-management as a concept in marine realm never existed prior to 2003 when we started working on this concept. So we gave this project name called Agatti Conservation Reserve because the project started actually in a small tiny island named Agatti in Lakshadweep archipelago on the west coast of India. The idea of co-management essentially is building bridges between people, livelihood, and conservation. It's a very novel model. It has been tried in many other places like small island nations, especially, but it has never been tried in a complex, country like India, where we have so much of diversity of everything, including biodiversity, social, linguistic, and so on and so forth. So it was a very challenging kind of a concept to begin with in 2002 when no baseline existed for us to refer to. So we started literally from the scratch. But to go to the concept, I think one need to understand why we need to have this model in India. It is very difficult to get formal protected areas so far as marine realms is concerned, as I've said earlier, because of access issues. Fishermen have to have access to the fishing resources, without which they will not be able to function as a society. And this access and tenure rights become very complicated because marking boundaries become very difficult, managing those boundaries become very difficult. We also do not have adequate manpower trained to manage marine resources. Most of our department is trained more for land management, not to the water resource management. Having said that, India is blessed with a very rich coastal and marine biodiversity. And there are four key fundamental biodiversity hotspot areas that we have. One is Gulf of Kutch in Gujarat. Then we have Lakshadweep archipelago on the west coast of India off Kerala coast. We have Gulf of Mannar in Tamil Nadu and Andaman Nicobar Island on the east coast of India. All these four reef formations are extraordinary in every sense. Andaman Nicobar, being very close to Coral Triangle, is one of the most rich coral reef area of the country. Lakshadweep, being the only atoll system that we have in India, is again standalone, very unique marine biodiversity area. Gulf of Mannar historically been very well studied, extremely rich in diversity, in a confluence between Sri Lanka and India, uh, divided into Gulf of Mannar and Palk Bay. Very, very interesting area. And Gulf of Kutch, which is the northernmost reef globally that we found, which has got a very high thermal threshold. So this makes all these four reefs very, very distinct and unique. And it provides us a great opportunity, therefore, to engage local community to see how we can manage these resources effectively with participatory kind of a model of conservation. Uh, we decided to work with Lakshadweep, obviously for multiple reasons for that. Firstly, of course, it's very, very rich in biodiversity. It's a very unique lagoon atoll ecosystem that we have. That's the only atoll ecosystem we have in India. Extremely fragile. These are all low-lying islands. Maximum elevation is between 1 to 2.5 meter. So very, very vulnerable to sea level rise and subsidence. Livelihood is completely dependent on natural resources. These islands were cut off for centuries from mainland, and the community evolved around utilizing these natural resources very wisely and very effectively for generations. Uh, Very, very distinct society. It's a 100% Muslim society, closely connected with nature simply because of their isolation. Uh, Also extremely remote in terms of its presence and access to these areas. It's also distinct in a society because it has very, very interesting characteristics. This is one of the most literate community, I would say, among the coastal communities. It has got 95% of literacy rate, which is an extraordinary literacy rate. This is how these islands look if you have an aerial view, and I'm going to show through the cursor how basically atoll system works. This is the smallest island called Bitra. The island is very tiny, but as you see, as my cursor is moving, this is what we call it as a reef crest. Now, this is the area which never get exposed to air except for extreme low tides. And this actually acts as a barrier between this massive lagoon that you see inside. So this almost like a calm swimming pool kind of a setting that you get in an atoll ecosystem. Minicoy is similarly, if you see a long island, and these are usually horseshoe-shaped kind of a structure. It has natural entrance for the lagoon. Larger lagoon usually have multiple entrances, like you have one on the north, is one in the middle area, and on the eastern side there is no lagoon. It's a very shallow exposed tidal flat. It's a very interesting case. If you're sitting in urban areas like Mumbai and Delhi, if you want to make decision for islands, it always wonder what kind of opportunities you can provide to people in terms of employment, giving this tiny size of the land that exists on the island. But if you stand on the island and look around you, you have got vast opportunities that this place gives for both conservation as well as livelihoods. So we need to change the perception when we look at management of these resources. Instead of doing land management, we have to look at more of a sea and ocean management to make a sustainable living out of this fragile environment. Again, as I said, the strength is a very high literacy. 92% women also have equal amount of literacy. Extremely skilled human resource, especially in the fishing sector, because generationally they have been doing this fishing in a very remote area. So tracking the sources of fish, finding their own islands after long fishing sortie, it's all evolved over a course of generational knowledge. Closely bonded social fabric. I think this is one of the most united community that we see. If they agree, the agreement is unanimous in that sense. Uh, Very willing to explore new avenues. Very entrepreneurial community based on my work on the islands. I stayed there for 10 years, but I have been going to the islands for almost last 40 years. And I have probably I'm more close to the islands. That's my second home, I call it as, than any other place in this country. I think they are great explorers and great explorers, not just for the sea, but the new avenues. Natural resource fortunately is abundant because this community has been extremely conservative in terms of harvesting their resources. So even today, if you see, they still practice pole and line tuna fishery, which is one of the best fishery that you can see, which has a zero bycatch. And one need to recognize that despite all these lucrative avenues exist around all other places, these communities still continue to practice this one of the most extraordinary zero bycatch kind of fishing practice. And a very distinct society values this community follows. Uh, when we started looking at this SWOT analysis before we embarked on this journey of Agatti Conservation Reserve, because community engagement takes a whole lot of time. It's not something you can do within few weeks or months. It takes years together. This area has inherent weaknesses also. Remoteness is one of the weakness, both its strength as well as weakness. Weakness because anything that you want to do on the island, the resources will come from mainland because most of the resources, except natural resources, cannot be produced on the island. There are large number of unorganized groups. When we started working, today things are very, very different. Today we are in 2020. This experiment started in 2003. So it's almost 17 years down the line. Things have much changed. But when we started, there are lots of unorganized groups, both men and women. Because of their isolation and because there was no market access to what they produce, most of the preference people preferred is for government job versus entrepreneurial skill at that time. Now, of course, things have changed. Connectivity has improved significantly. Now you will see a lot of other entrepreneurial skills coming on the island. The only drawback for this weakness for this community is politically it's very, very divided. And when you are doing community engagements, you have to be sensitive for all these weaknesses because you have to build on those weaknesses. You have to insulate your model towards these weaknesses. And it has also threats, number of threats. Mainland invasion, though this area, is protected under schedule of constitution that you cannot buy land on this island, and rightly so. But yet, if you take, for example, tourism as a model, then it can have its own consequences on this very small land mass. It's just 32 square kilometer land. We are talking about spread across 36 islands. So it's a very, very small landmass. So any intervention we decide to do, it has its own consequences. Habitat destruction at times unintentionally has been happening. Also, the climate change and other kind of development, such as jetty development or ship movement development within lagoon, also has its consequences on habitat. Disintegration of social fabric in the sense that now there is so much access to social media and all other those platforms which never existed before. So earlier it was a very, very close knit kind of a society. But by bringing into tourism and all this kind of culture, there is a real risk that social fabric may get completely disintegrated over course of time. It's a very high density population. It's almost 91,000 people according to 2019 census. And if you look at the landmass, which is just 36 square kilometer, and of which the inhabited islands are only 11, it's a very, very high density population. And the biggest threat, of course, for these islands is climate change and sea level rise. Having all those strength, weaknesses kind of assessment, what we have done, then the question is how then we move ahead with the concept of community engagement in conservation. Therefore, it requires a very new approach because the settings are not very, common. These are very, very extraordinary and different kind of setting that we have on these islands. It requires newer approaches. We need to look at value-added economy instead of promoting more intensive kind of a fishery. Participatory conservation is a very, very new concept on the island in itself. Strengthening youth capacity, because the new model of conservation, probably youth have not equipped with that kind of change that has happened globally. and developing leadership skills. Though there is lot of entrepreneurial skills, I think leadership skill is something which will drive this model to its success. Because if this model has to be successful, the leadership has to come from the island. It cannot be an external interface based on funding and intervention. It's not going to be sustainable. So we knew exactly, what is that we want to do. Of course, we don't know how to go about that, and that's something we decided to then take help of traditional wisdom of these people. But before that, I think biodiversity of this place is extraordinary. Some of the most endangered species today that we have in this country exist on that island and in abundance. And that's something that we have to protect for prosperity for future generation. Uh, the basic concept, and it is still been contemplated, not just in India, globally, is can marine protected areas enhance livelihood and protect biodiversity? Uh, we also have the same question, whether this will work in Lakshadweep, whether it will have its own impact. Uh, but that is the ultimate goalpost. Once you started working, your ultimate goalpost is to see whether your efforts have really benefited a community at the end of the day. So this was a goalpost that we had back of our mind right in 2003. That time we had no answer for this question. So this was a big question we started with. And we come up with three larger components for this project. We as an institution, I represent Bombay Natural History Society, where I'm director currently. But our function of society is that any conservation advocacy we want to do, it has to be based on very sound science. We don't want to get into pseudo science kind of an approach in conservation, which is much risky than having no science as such. So this project has a very strong component on biodiversity research. We need to know those reefs very well. We need to understand the resources those people are using and what is happening to the population of those resources. So within biodiversity, we recognize that it's a very, very rich and complex ecosystem. And if you want to make any benchmark uh, in terms of enumeration of benefits or impact, you need to have a surrogate within that complex of species. So we identified giant clam, which is one of the longest living species. I'll talk about it later on, as one of the important surrogate to monitor over a course of time uh, to see how those reefs are responding to different climatic conditions. And then corals, of course, is very important because it's a coral reef ecosystem. And bait fish, it's very, very important. Actually, bait fish is the most crucial aspect for islands' livelihood. If you have to do pole and line fishing for tuna, you have to have bait fish for it. So bait fish, in a way, is absolutely essential component that exists mostly in the lagoon area. So conservation of lagoon, therefore, is very, very important. And I think that is one of the trigger why we could get a very good support of coastal fisher when you talk integration of conservation of corals and bait fish, because bait fish is absolutely vital for them. Then second component, of course, was community development, in which we split into two. There's an awareness, general awareness about reef, corals, about general environment, both to adults as well as to children. And then very target specific training. For example, can ecotourism be one of the value added economy for the island? What are marine protected areas and concept of marine protected areas? Now, this was essential, and plus the co-management. What is the concept of co-management? Because this has never been done in India before. So there is no model that existed for us to follow. Now, these three training aspects were very, very essential for our facilitator, because our facilitator are the one who were to go into the community over a course of next 3-4 years to work with these people to the ultimate goal of the concept of conservation reserve. And then sustainable development, essentially for teacher, how we can then keep engaging students through teachers and formal education. And then the third component of advocacy, how we can take this model from a local level to regional level to national level to international level. And we have to have a very strong approach for the advocacy for it. So this project has these three broad components of biodiversity research, community development, and advocacy. But before we go to the model, why giant clam? That's a lot of people used to ask me questions. When we started this project in 2002, uh, it's a very very unique species within coral reef ecosystem. It is found exclusively in tropical reefs. It's found nowhere else than tropical reef. It is grow in shallow waters, uh, ranging between 2 meters to 15 meters. Small population exists up to 40 meters, but very very shallow water. They are permanently anchored, so they cannot move from one place to other place. Thus, extremely vulnerable for all kinds of pressures, including exploitation, to climate change, to sedimentation, habitat destruction, and so on and so forth. Very unique symbiotic association with algae called zooxanthellae. These animals cannot survive without this unicellular algae present inside the tissue of this animal. It has synchronized mode of spawning that both male and female simultaneously release uh, all clams together will first release the eggs, and after the eggs, same animal will start releasing the sperms. So they are simultaneous hermaphrodites, what we call it as, but it has a synchronized mode of spawning. And why this is very important? Because unless you have a significant number of adult clams within a given area, the fertilization, which is external, which is not possible. And therefore, you need to have a very good density of clams to have this kind of successful breeding and spawning. It has a very long life. They are known to live almost up to 200 to 300 years. So that's an extraordinary life for any invertebrate that you see. It has got extremely short larval life. Uh, as you know, there's a fertilization external. So the young larval form can float around for not more than 7 days. So within 7 days, if they do not find suitable habitat, then obviously the entire spawn will die out. So they need really good quality habitat around, and they grow extremely slow because they are long lived. Their annual growth range between 1 millimeter to 10 millimeter per year. That's how slow they grow annually. So sometimes measuring growth also is very, very challenging for these animals. So all these characteristics make this as one of the most powerful surrogate for monitor the health of reef ecosystem. Uh, then we come to MPA establishment process. It's a very, very complicated process because it's involved all multiple aspects. Include research, include community awareness, it includes stakeholder analysis. You need to understand the existing laws and pros and cons within those laws. You have to understand customary laws that existed uh, for generations. Based on all this analysis of stakeholders, based on research, what is going to be boundaries, the regulation, then you have to have the management plan as a discussion document. This management plan has to be again discussed extensively with the community through number of consultation meetings, take their suggestion, views, reservation on board. You have to have forest department with you. You have to have panchayat endorsement to that process. So it flows through a very systematic, well led down channel of communication from research consultation to the final notification of the conservation reserve. And it has to be very well orchestrated. You cannot take shortcuts in this process. There are no shortcuts for if you want to be successful in community engagement. It's a sheer hard work that involved into getting trust, winning trust of people. Uh, so we started with research-based capacity as part of our biodiversity intervention. Uh, so if you look at the activities that we split into various work that we have done, basically on 5 different components. One is the giant clam and coral reef research that we carried out on 24 islands. Live bait fishery research we restricted to 2 because our area of intervention was Agatti, but we also included Kavaratti as another island because it's the capital of Lakshadweep Archipelago to have more understanding of 2 complex island systems. Education awareness, we worked on 9 islands. The Bitra has been very, very small, so we decided not to go to that place. Ecotourism training we have done for 3 islands, Agatti, Kavaratti, and Bangaram and Tinakara, because in 2003, Bangaram was one of the most important tourism destination, a high-end tourism destination, and there are a lot of local employment happening there. So we wanted to make sure that whatever employment happens at this resort, the preference should be given for the island community more. So we decided to train local youth on this aspect. And then marine protected area training we did for one island, Agatti, which was our focal area that time. Of course, subsequently we scaled up work into other areas, but in 2003, this is how we split our work portfolio into different islands. If you look at training, and I'm going to present this case for first half for only about initial 3 years, because our initial phase was 3 years, which subsequently got extended by 2 more years. So I would say 5 years. Now, in professional diving, for example, we have trained 10 youths. In Tridacna research ecological monitoring, we have trained more than 95 youths. And this training is not just one-day training. This is a thorough professional training. Diving, for example, we did certification of these people all the way up to dive master. And that involves great amount of financial investment also. Ecological monitoring, very intensive monitoring in terms of methodology of line transact underwater. That we because this spread of this work was so extensive that we required that kind of a trained human resource to make significant transact, statistically viable data that we need to collect over course of time. Now, ecotourism, we have trained about 45 youths, and marine protected areas, we trained about 11 youths in the beginning, in the first year. And then leadership training, it was very important for us because this model, if it has to succeed, the leadership has to come from the island. And knowing this well, we have taken two very bright, promising young students. If you that time they're students, of course, today they are doing fantastic into various government institutions. We have sent them for extensive training for these two young, bright young kids to Australia, UK, Belgium, and many other places to understand the different concepts of conservation, not just conservation, but also we have trained them on leadership. Because this project was initiated through a very interesting institution called Leadership for Environment and Development. Originally, it was supported by Darwin Initiative of UK government and subsequently by Whitley Foundation. And the focus of both of these is that you just don't train them on sustainability, on conservation. You also train them on leadership skills so that they can take the community together when it matters most. And we want to prepare these youth for that. A training approach, when we went there and when we started doing baseline surveys, we realized that these people are not very keen on watching a lot of things. I mean, they get very restless after 10-15 minutes. Their engagement, maintaining engagement is very, very difficult beyond 15 minutes. But they're extremely interested in hands-on, active, interactive, experiential learning. So we have to completely change our model from classroom training to more hands-on, active, interactive, experiential learning. So making video documentaries, for example, was very popular that time, and people have developed this very nice small 2-minute, 3-minute island clips, and they used to come back to us saying that, oh, this is something interesting we saw today on turtle, and so on and so forth. So we distributed few, that time cameras, digital cameras were underwater, especially were very few. I would call megapixel, but we still used to get very interesting information through this experiential learning. They're more interested working outside classroom, and that was a complete new innovation that we have to bring out during our training program, is to do out of class training. Also adaptive learning, because these islands are so vulnerable to sea level rise. We also want to enshrine into our training very subtly is to how this community needs to slowly adapt, not just in terms of how they work on the islands, but also in terms of their behavior and acceptance for the fact that they are most vulnerable. Uh, so that was very, very important in terms of adaptive learning process and building resilience as one of the concept in our formal training approaches. Now, environmental education, we reached to more than 1,500 students to various islands. We did a lot of lagoon cleanup campaign, painting competition, traveling film festival, reef walks, audio visuals. Inter-island, there is a ferry service. And our movies that we developed, like Our Island, was so popular that almost every ferry, for 2 hours, they used to play this 1-hour movie. And people really used to enjoy because this was developed by the community themselves. with of course professional photographer that we got from the mainland who train these people. So it was a very, very interesting exercise that we found very useful in terms of enrolled education. But at the end of it, uh, unless you address livelihood issues, all your training is great, people enjoy it, they learn it, but to translate that into conservation, you have to look at economics. There is no model I have seen which will work effectively if you do not address economics of the place. And for those islands, economics actually is very small. We are not talking about economics of huge scale. We are talking of pole and line fishery, which they get tuna, which is very, very fresh, for which they need bait fish. So their entire livelihood revolve around very few key aspects of bait fish, tuna. In monsoon season, when they cannot go for tuna fishing, most of their day-to-day needs are met by lagoon fishing. And how you traditionally these people used to use this fishing gear, which are very less destructive for reefs, for lagoon fishing, because they understood the value of these coral reefs very well. But understanding and addressing these livelihood issues is very, very critical for the entire conservation journey of what we started in 2003. And to do any intervention, you of course need to know what knowledge exists within community. It's not that we brought something extraordinary on the table for the community. In fact, most of the extraordinary knowledge came from the community on the table for conservation for us to look at. Now, for example, which are the areas these people use for tourism when tourists go there? Which are the areas where they collect cowries, for example, which add not great value to the economy, but it's more of a social function. Cowrie collection is done mostly by women and children. And the only time all the women on the island can come together with children and have social chat are these events during low tide. All these women will come out, there will be hardly any men around, and then they will go out collecting these small cowries. What they get at the end of the day is a very meager in terms of money. But islands is not about money. It's about how these people learn, unlearn, being socially together. And cowrie collection, for the first time we understood that it's not an economic activity, it's more of a social activity. Now, having that perspective is very, very important, because many a time we say, oh, that cowrie collection is illegal. We only look through one lens of protection. But we don't understand that if you encourage them, for example, not to collect cowries when they are on the eggs or laying eggs, you can do actually far better conservation than prohibiting these people not going to this, because this is a social activity, not economic activity. While on the other hand, for bait fish, for example, if you see on the left side, this map, this kind of bait fish areas given to us, which are with GPS track. We went with this fisherman into lagoon areas. They showed us where they used to get, very good bait fish. Now, this is a knowledge that existed for the old fishermen, population. They used to go to these areas when they were very active fisher. If you see young fishermen today, the bait fish areas have completely changed. Now, knowing this science is very, very important when you want to develop management plan for any area. So actually natural resource mapping brought in far more interesting knowledge, and it's not just anecdotal knowledge. I think this is a very, very robust scientific knowledge. They may not know the scientific names of the species, but they know where exactly that species and how that species interact with its environment. And I think that is far more important than just the name of a species. Then we looked at society values and system in terms of, if you have to bring develop adaptive capacity, which lead to resilience, then you need to look at two: ecological systems as well as social systems. It's very, very important. In ecological systems, it's very well laid down: genetic diversity, biological diversity, and then heterogeneity of landscape mosaics, because this is not a monoculture, monotypic setting that we have. So the second dimension, the social system, we need to understand institutions that first learn and store knowledge and experience, which is very, very important. Create flexibility in problem solving, because these islands are so isolated for so many centuries that they have their inherent inbuilt system of problem solving. They were not dependent on anybody else to solve their problems, and they have this mechanism within the community. and balance power among interest groups. These are the three institutions within social system that we need to understand to build into your conservation model. And working with people. Now, which are the institutions that learn, store knowledge and experience? We need to know that, because these are very, very important in view of traditional knowledge system that we want to bring into our management plan. Which are the institutions that create flexibility? Besides the formal administrative establishment, within community, which are those institutions that create this flexibility? An institution that balance power. I think these are very, very three important learning we ourselves had. We never had this kind of learning before going to the island. So this is what actually people brought into the table when we started discussing with not even the concept, but just to understand the dynamics of environment of these beautiful islands. So therefore, our strategy to increase adaptive capacity evolved after understanding of these dimensions, both ecological and social, is training and learning to live with change and uncertainty. I think more than us, these people are much more resilient to change and uncertainty. That is our fundamental understanding, because island life is so uncertain, and I have experienced that for so many years, that you not just have to have plan A, B, and C. You need to have plan A to Z if you want to survive on these islands effectively. So in a way that, yes, they are very much exposed to the change and uncertainty. Nurturing diversity for resilience, they understand that if you talk to them, why they do not harvest everything together, and they understand, no, this is a breeding time for X thing, so you cannot harvest this, and they follow it much more religiously than any other community I have seen on other places or mainland coastal ecosystem. Combining different types of knowledge of learning, indigenous and scientific, is again very, very important. You cannot just speak science minus traditional knowledge. I think you have to blend both together to make sense for the community, and creating opportunity for self-organization towards social and ecological sustainability. I think unless the community organizes themselves, no external intervention can be sustainable beyond the project tenure. So these are essentially the four components that we have to increase adaptive capacity of the islands, which we enshrine into our training. And Andrea Derry, who was actually our technical consultant on capacity building program, she has an extraordinary, woman deputed by Lead International. She spent significant amount of time with us for 3 years almost on the islands on training these people, which actually brought in a fantastic dimensions to our entire community engagement process that she brought in into this. And then we did massive community consultation. For 3 years, we had covered 80% of adult population on the Agatti Island for MPA consultation, which is an extraordinary feat. I don't think any MPA process has achieved this number in terms of consultation. We consulted 50% fishermen, 40% women, because this is, again, you have to understand that though it's a Muslim community, it is, woman dominated, woman centric community. Woman has a great central role into everything, right from household to decision making. Women play a significant role. And in fact, most of powerful engagement that has happened on the islands are through women facilitators. And some of these women received subsequently, several awards for the kind of work they have done within community. Youths again are very, very important. We have to work with youths if it has to be sustainable. You have to have government support, because eventually it's a co-management principle. It's, the government is equal stakeholder in management of these resources. Tourism sector, again, we decided to engage because we thought it's a good supplementary economy, though it is very risky and dangerous to put island economic planning just based on tourism, because now you see today what is happening with this all lockdown. Had Lakshadweep economic model based on tourism, it would have collapsed completely. But since they are not depending on tourism as a primary sector, they are still perfectly okay. Service providers and then teachers again are very, very important. Who are the community facilitators? all of them. I have listed only about 9, which are the key community facilitators, but we had more than 100 because there are different groups of people on different islands doing facilitation of this entire process. It has a local face. This whole project has a local face, and one of the reason why this has become very popular model and successful model, because there is not a single outside face that you see into 100 plus community facilitators that were working with the community. So they had absolute unrestricted access right from their homes to their functions to all kinds of events that we otherwise will find it extremely difficult to, and also language as a huge barrier. Uh, and that was our very conscious decision as the project. When we started working, I said we do not want any external face to this program. This should live its own life, even if we doesn't exist for this project. We are there to help, but we doesn't exist so far as this community engagement is concerned. And based on this 3 years engagement with community plus bringing into the very hardcore science, we decided about 10 square kilometer of area identified jointly with community to develop as a Agatti Conservation Reserve. And once this area was identified, then the next process was to develop the management plan, discuss the management plan through a whole range of meetings, take their views on board. But in 2008, rather late 2007, we got endorsement from the Agatti Panchayat that they have given their consent to establish this Agatti Conservation Reserve to the Lakshadweep administration. This is a very significant step that we are able to achieve, and I'm going to decipher the reasons why we are able to achieve and the learnings we have for this process to be replicated in many places. Uh, so this is how we worked on, first thing, a species recovery action plan we developed for Government of India, and then conservation reserve management plan we developed along with community consultation. This exists as a model for anybody to follow. These are available for public use as a model, how we can actually go about developing a consultation based model for conservation. The great news, of course, is that this model actually never progressed further, unfortunately, for whatever reasons within government system and whatever apprehensions, that existed, despite the fact that we did whole range of consultation, not just with community. Actually, we did consultation with the lawyers, with legal consultant to understand if there are any kind of uh, pitfalls this model will have in terms of access of these people to resources. And despite insulating all this, I think there are reasons which I don't want to speak about, but this could not go beyond this specific point. Though we had, so it was more of a voluntary implementation of management plan rather than a formal notification under the Wildlife Protection Act. But simultaneously, while we were there, I think one of our uh, basis, and the first thing which I realized when I went on the island formally, I've been going to the islands since 1980, but in 2003 I went there actually to stay there for 10 years, and that's the first time I had more personal perspective of how people look at you. If you are as a visitor, they are fine, happy, you'll be there for 5-10 days, go, so they are happy to smiling, and see you off and welcome you when you are there. But when you're actually there and when you talk about things which matters to them for their day-to-day life, first question they ask is, what is your interest? And what is the guarantee that after your funding is over that you are not going to leave the island and leave this project in between? So the first commitment that we have to give to this islanders rather, is that even if this funding gets over, even if we have no money left to run the project, BNHS will maintain its base in Lakshadweep and will continue to train your people, continue to speak for conservation in Lakshadweep. And I think that assurance was very, very important. So even if the project actually got ended in 2007, and then we got 2 more years of grant from Whitley Foundation to run it till 2009, BNHS continued to have its presence on the islands even today with its full-fledged field station on the islands, working for the islands. So even if this project is not there, people still know BNHS. And while we were there, We continue to work on 2 or 3 different areas to develop the similar model, do research, do consultation, get baseline data. And 3 islands out of these are very, very important for us are 2 uninhabited lagoons that we have, Beliapani and Veliapani, north of Bitra, uh, and Suheli, which is south of Kavrati, which is again a very, very pristine lagoon. So we submitted these 3 documents to administration subsequently that this also can be looked at in terms of conservation reserve. And to our absolute delight and pleasure, the new dynamic forest officer, Mr. Damodaran, who took over 2 years ago, uh, found merit in many of these ideas and concepts. And he managed to get extraordinary feat of achievement in 2019, end of 2019, early 2020, I would say. 3 conservation reserve newly notified by Lakshadweep administration totaling 654 square kilometer. Cheryapani Sea Cucumber Reserve of 239 square kilometer. This is the only reserve for sea cucumber globally, the first sea cucumber reserve globally. Then Pitti Marine Conservation Reserve spans 344 square kilometer, and Veliapani Marine Bird Conservation Reserve of 62 square kilometer. So this model, though, has not achieved, Agati Conservation Reserve as such has not achieved what it desired to achieve in 3 to 4 years. We are actually able to achieve far more from 10 square kilometer model to 654 square kilometer for model. And why this is so extraordinary? I think this is a evidence that people still there believe in conservation. They are pro conservation, and we need to build this exact, belief these people have on conservation, that they are fine, they are willing to conserve this area, but the access to their natural resource should not be prohibited because their entire life and livelihood depends on that access. So long as that access is not denied, and so long as they have been given prescription to manage that resource very well, which they are willing to do that, I think this is the best place you can have many more protected areas, community managed conservation reserve. That is a reality. And what this 654 square kilometer has achieved is that what we are not able to achieve under our sustainable development goals, targets that we have, this 654 is going to contribute significantly to Government of India's commitment to global community of conservation, expansion of marine reserve under goal 14 of SDGs. So this is an extraordinary feat. This could be achieved only because there was a very good model that we worked with engaging people, and engaging people with a right intent, not just because it is driven by a project-based objective that in 3 years you have to achieve this much. So when we went to our donors saying that, look, we have done our best, but this has not culminated into what we anticipated, they said final notification is not the only thing. I think getting people on agreeing on a concept itself is a significant benchmark success for this project. And most of our donors were extremely pleased with the kind of process, because we have not taken any shortcuts in the process, and we are not knowing what's going to be the outcome when we started with. Management objectives are very, very crisp. Our focus, of course, is on the giant clams because this is a globally endangered species, and we use this as a surrogate. So we definitely want to look at Triadacna, though Triadacna actually acts as no means for the islanders. They don't eat it, it's just one species for them. But it for us as a scientific community is very important because it gives us signatures of climate change much more pointedly than any other species. Then sustainable live bait harvesting. Live bait is critical. So anything you talk on the island about how we can save and enhance live bait, everybody, every single fisherman is on board with you to discuss this issue. It's so close to their heart. Then to increase the resistance and resilience of the reef, how we can make this reef, because there are few things which are beyond human intervention. Like, for example, coral bleaching, which I'll talk a little bit in last 5-10 minutes. And then the last point is to increase the adaptive capacity of local community. We know these islands are going to get drowned. It's not whether they will, it's a matter when will they. It may be 50 years, it may be 60 years, it may be 70 years, it may be 100 years, but they will drown. There's no doubt about that, and one should be completely prepared for this reality that will eventually this will happen for this place. And therefore, making these people aware, I think people also understand. It's not that they are not uh, aware of this reality with the kind of sea level rise that's happening and the kind of predictions we have. uh, this is probable reality in we don't know when, but it will be for sure. What are the lessons we learn from that? And I think these are the lessons very important for whoever want to make interventions of this nature with the community. I think transparency of the process is foundation of this entire project. You have to disclose every single thing. And so, when we started working, the first thing people asked is, oh, you got a lot of money. I said, look, my account is in front of you. This is what we got. This is what we are spending for. And our books of accounts, when we made access to books of accounts to the people, I think that's the first transparency that you bring into your functions within community, that we are not here to earn money. All these resources are going to get invested into the process and the people of the island. Integration of a credible science is very, very important, because we cannot make interventions based on pseudo science. BNHS will fail in its fundamental foundation principles if we get into pseudo science and pseudo science based activism. Uh, Broad-based consultation. There are no shortcuts to that. I think every single household, probably these community facilitators have met while we are there in Agatti for 4 years. And consultation has to be open. Many a times, people used to criticize. You have to take all those things into stride, because this is all part and parcel of engaging community. You have to recognize traditional knowledge. Now, of course, Biodiversity Act provides that provision. Unfortunately, during that time, Biodiversity Act was not so well known on the island. So role of PBRs and all those things were not known when we were working on the island. Woman empowerment. I mean, though Lakshadweep society is is a very woman-centric society. I would say it's a matrilineal system. They still follow, which is an extraordinary society that we have. But recognizing them and giving them a central role as a part of process, for our point of view, was also equally important. In fact, there were more women working on our project than men, except of course for our research, because that time women were not going in water to do work. Of course, that also barrier slowly is breaching. I understand now there are few women divers, which Lakshadweep has, which is an extraordinary uh, achievement. And that's what the education makes difference in a society. Very high literacy rate. We need to we need to be politically neutral, because this one society, I realize, is politically very divided. And how, therefore, I think therefore the credible science makes a lot of sense, because then you talk only about science. You don't talk about pseudo aspects of whatever views you may have. But staying politically neutral is very, very important. Customary laws are very, very important. You need to recognize them. You need to work within this, and you can actually these laws can come very handy to you. And I can give one instance, to you. When we are moving from one island to other island, and our boys have forgot one camera, or probably somebody would have taken that camera from the island. And when these boys were going through the boat and they wanted to take some pictures, and this one of our staff realized, oh, there's no camera. And then they realized probably they either have lost or somebody has taken. So they come back to the island. They have seen it's not there in the room. So they called me and I said, sir, should we make a police complaint? I said, no, don't go to police complaint. It's a small place. See what are other ways by which you can encourage. So he spoke in one of the, I think, mosque, and this religious leader then announced in the evening that if somebody has done, please make sure these people get their camera back. And to our surprise, next day morning, our camera was nicely packed outside our room uh, before we get up in the morning. I mean, that kind of, uh, thing doesn't exist in many places. So we have to believe in that people are very, very different in these small islands, because they evolve very differently. And local empowerment is, again, very, 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 very important for that. Now, does our job ends here? Definitely no. I mean, this is just a process. Declaration actually is a process. The real management will happen only when uh, you ask yourself all these six fundamental questions. Is our science accurate? Only time will tell, and I will show you through some slides in terms of science. Are our arguments right? Does really marine protected areas benefit conservation or species enhancement or species recovery in the marine realm? Are our arguments right? Are our facilitators trained enough? Have they really communicated the essence of science to these people? Does our withdrawal strategy on track? Uh, because every single program have to have withdrawal strategy. You have to hand over that baton, and therefore, have we trained enough youths on the islands as a part of our process that they will continue with this legacy, irrespective of whether we are there or not? Have we motivated enough people, and have we motivated people enough? I think these are the six fundamental questions now we have to find answers for if we have to prove a point that yes, conservation reserve makes sense, it achieves its goal, and it does contribute to the conservation by and large for the resource we're talking about. Uh, the real worry for that is there are things which are beyond human intervention and human control. And this slide, which we have, and this is part of our research, and recently we published this paper in one of the best peer-reviewed journal, international journal. If you look at since 1960, the sea surface temperature is something which, this is a bit scientific. We probably all have heard of these two terms called El Nino and El Nina. El Nino is a phenomena where sea surface temperature raises significantly. How far it raises, it depends on the severity of El Nino. And El Nino is very, very important because it influences everything. Whatever happens in sea influence on land. So all our rainfall that happens, everything get influenced because of El Nino. If it's a strong El Nino, then it has certain predictive for rainfall. If it's a weak El Nino, then there are certain predictive for rainfall. But El Nino in sea is a super disaster. Elevated sea surface temperature, and I will come to that point, is how sensitive these marine organisms are towards temperature. If you look at, for example, 1960s, since we have this data available, global database of temperature, how consistently sea surface temperature is increasing. The probability of bleaching threshold temperature, look at how significantly it is increasing consistently over a course. And since 2000 onwards, rather 1990 onwards, the increase is exponential. Exponential not necessarily in terms of huge number, but exponential in the sense from 27 degrees to 31 degree, 30 degrees. I think in a marine realm, SST is an exponential change in sea surface temperature. What this change will have impact on, I will show you on next slide. Now, this is the Tridacna clam population we monitored on 3 islands for last 17 years, starting from 2003 till 2019, and it will continue for another 20 years or so because these species require long-term monitoring. So the populations are quite undulating, so we started with base figure. Before that, there was no base figure available. Then it went down, and then slowly, it increased up to a point, and then suddenly you have a bleaching event in 2010. Then suddenly population crashed below certain threshold, continued to fall below threshold. In between, again, there is a second El Nino that has happened in 2016. There is a milder recovery because there is a good amount of spawning after bleaching. So a lot of juveniles got recruited into population. But again, in 2019, there is a major bleaching, and again, population has crashed. So this is a typical undulating pattern you will see always in long-lived species, where the recovery will be slow. And if you allow, actually, if no El Nino would have happened, probably this recovery would have been much better. But every El Nino makes this species vulnerable. Their breeding get redundant. They don't breed very effectively or breed very poorly. And breeding is something which adds to actually the population, because adult population here is very, very small. And that's one of the concerns. But if you look at, for example, this is the thermal threshold, we realize that when sea surface temperature cross 30 degrees, the Tridacna will undergo bleaching. And when temperature crosses 29 degrees, corals will start bleaching. Now look at how many times since 2003, the SST has breached this 30 in 2009, in 2016, in 2019, and 2018, almost close to that. So very consistently, the sea surface temperature thresholds now nowhere you will see spanning from 2003. And if you see the previous slide of 27 degrees when it was in 1960, since 2003, it never ever came before below 29 degrees. So almost the sea surface temperature in the islands have settled to almost between 28 to 29, and at times it crossing or breaching 30-degree mark. Now that's a disastrous trend for sea surface temperature for number of species which get bleached because of sea surface temperature, leading to mortality. There's another sympatric species that we have along with Tridacna maxima is a squamous. It's much larger species, and its population decline is far phenomenal. But of course, we do not have a long-term data. We started on this species working only in 2013, and it also will have same stochastic uh, graph, which I believe which will get established. Another 10 years we continue to work. It has seen only one bleaching and two bleaching events actually uh, to make better projection for this species. But this species population is far less compared to the more common species that we have. In conclusion, what has we established through science is that 30 degrees definitely trigger bleaching in Tridacna. And if this continue for a very significant time of more than 50 to 60 days, it leads to mortality. Thankfully, in Lakshadweep, bleaching usually happens in late or mid-May to late May. And monsoon almost starts simultaneously. So maximum exposure Lakshadweep gets because of El Nino is most of the time less than 3 weeks. And that's a good enough time for the corals and maximum these giant clams to recover well, because mortality will happen only if the corals mortality will happen only if this SST exceeds more than 3 weeks, and for Tridacna it's more than 5 to 6 weeks. Now, time series analysis that we did from 65 to 2016, however, indicated increasing incidence of bleaching temperature, which almost beta of 0.09, which is quite significant actually, standard error of 0.04. Now, population level response to elevated, SST. What is going to be the then response of this elevated SST if 29 is now a normal norm for SST on the islands? That it has a high risk of quasi-extinction of the species and low density. I will not go into that technical jargon much, but under prevailing high bleaching temperature regimes that we have, this species definitely has a real risk of extinction. Not in immediate future, but definitely if you don't do interventions, if we don't do artificial ranching of clams in a very aggressive manner, this species does, it will compromise the viability of giant clam population. So long as adults are there, recruitment process will go on. But if adult mortality increases because of this, then it's doomed. Like this entire population, for example, in Andaman Nicobar is doomed. Is virtually beyond, I would call, biological repair. And then there was a very lovely paper by Hughes et al. In 2018, which actually proved beyond doubt that tropical reef systems are transitioning to a new era in which the interval between recurrent bouts of coral bleaching is too short for a full recovery of mature assemblages. They also predicted that every hot summer, with or without an El Nino event, has a potential to cause bleaching and mortality at a regional scale. Now, that's an extremely scary situation for the islands like Lakshadweep, whose lives are so closely linked with their, so it will affect everything. I think when corals die, every single species that exists into coral reef ecosystem will have its consequences. Now, rebuilding corals are closer to thermal maxima, undoubtedly. Globally, that has been proved that 29 degrees, I said, is where corals undergo bleaching. And we have seen that many regional level thermal ranges are between 28 to 29. So they are already close to thermal maximum. How long it will take before that thermal maxima to breach to 30 and cause irreversible damage to reefs, we don't know. Only time will tell us. But Australia, for example, this year, this is a third consecutive year Australia is undergoing massive coral bleaching, which is Now, under these circumstances, recovery of reef becomes very, very difficult unless you do some extraordinary measures to help reef to recover. We need an innovation restoration strategy. The traditional mariculture and all those things we can continue, but for corals, you need to look at reverse transplantation. I think you require revolutionary ideas. These ideas were criticized a lot when I started talking about it into social platform. Oh, that's a risk. This, my point is that if you don't try this, anyway, these reefs are doomed in near future. Uh, of course, you cannot take corals from one area and put it into other area. It has to go through very thorough scientific assessment of risk associated with it, because it's not just the coral you shift from one place to other place. You shift the symbodium strain that is associated with that coral. You shift the diseases associated with that corals into other area. So unless you do an experimental model in a controlled laboratory conditions to see how this, for example, coral reef from Gulf of Kutch same species that exist in Lakshadweep can be transported from Gulf of Kutch to Lakshadweep. Unless you do a experimental model on risk assessment, this risk anyway, these reefs are anyway at the risk of collapse in down the line 2 or 3 decades. Fortunately, Gulf of Kutch is a very, very unique place because it's the northernmost reef. It is far more tolerant. If you see during low tide, these corals get completely exposed. They're all out of water, and they create a very huge thick layer of mucus to protect itself from the very high sun radiation. In an exposed shallow pools, if you take temperature, it can reach at times to 40-45 degrees centigrade during the low tide. Now in that high warm water, during entire exposure, and this exposure in Gulf of Kutch is also extraordinary. It's not like our areas of uh, you know, Konkan or Karnataka or Kerala, where exposure is only for 2-3 hours. In Gulf of Kutch, exposure tidal amplitude is so massive that exposure sometimes extends all the way almost up to 5 hours, 6 hours, which is an extraordinary exposure these corals grow. And it has been proved that even in 1998 El Nino, which was one of the most massive El Nino, the Gulf of Kutch reefs were relatively less affected, even that worst of the situation. So we need to look at these models of transplantation. We have left with no choice but to do. I'm not saying we should do that, but at least we should do a risk assessment. And if we found it makes sense, and if it's safe to do that, then we should try that, even if it's just a smaller scale. And what are the trends, for example? Tridacna maxima population, and it's a very fairly robust 17 years data that we have through very rigorous scientific methodology that we followed. Now, Agatti Island, which we have proposed actually in the conservation reserve, has almost 50% decline in the population. In fact, this is again one of the reasons why we should still further continue to work on Agatti Conservation Reserve as a model and do intervention, because here population of this species is in a dramatic decline. Look at, on the contrary, Bangaram and Tinakkara, uninhabited island. Very few footprint of human beings on this island. There's an increase of 9.76%. Kavarati is an extraordinary reef. We have seen 1.11% increase, despite is one of the most populated, one of the most traffic. But again, the lagoon is very, very small. So many a times our sample size here gets sometimes skewed because we can do actually very good sample size in Kavarati. Bangaram is a huge 36 square kilometer lagoon. So our sample size, is relatively very, very small, Bangaram and Agatti. But these trends are quite robust, and it suggests that island by island, this species is responding very differently. Now, the next challenge that we have as a research fraternity is, what are those factors responsible? Why this species is responding differently into different islands? And finding those factors is going to be the key for deciphering what is happening with this species, because our answer for restoration and recovery depends on finding these answers for these three interesting cases where we have seen 50% decline in one, 10% increase in another 1% increase in the third island, which is very, very different. For squamousa, of course, our data is very, very small. It's just 6 years data, so cannot really predict much, but it's an overall decline between 30 to 50% across. And we anticipated this because this is a very large species compared to maxima is relatively very small. species. This is very large species, and they naturally occur in very less number. So recruitment is naturally very low. And if one adult dies out, it has its cascading impact on the general population for it. Last slide. I'm going to conclude with one very important point is we need to understand trade-offs. Are El Ninos or cyclones new to nature? I said no. Nature and these ecosystems have seen far more violent episodes than this, what they're witnessing now. Earth has still survived some of the most violent events that has ever happened since the evolution of the Earth. What will happen if entire hard coral ecosystem will die out, for example, in Lakshadweep? Minus human context. I'm talking purely on a natural context. Will it affect the ecosystem processes as such? To my understanding, no. It will just transit from one ecosystem to other ecosystem. Like we have seen in Lakshadweep, we have a lot more soft coral than we used to have previous to 1998, because soft coral are not, they don't have zooxanthellae. They don't undergo, except for few species, most of them don't undergo bleaching. They also exist slightly in a deeper water. And when hard coral disappeared, it provided a fantastic substrate for soft coral to grow and flourish. So in a natural ecosystem, what we call it as a community shift is a natural process. It not necessarily it will be soft coral, it can be something else, but a community shift will happen naturally. Why this is important in our context, why we are even debating this in terms of its impact? Because our lives are so closely linked with the ecosystem. Minus human, I don't think it will make any difference. Life will continue in a different form, fashion, structure, and so on and so forth, but it will continue. But it affects lives and livelihoods of millions of people globally. And that is why this shift, community shift, impact of El Nino, impact of cyclones matters us most, because lots of people will lose their livelihoods if ecosystem integrity. Because currently, for example, if I have to give a classic case, today most of the fishing which Lakshadweep people are doing is of hard coral associated fauna and the pelagic tuna. None of these community members have exposed to a different ecosystem. Maybe that skill will come over a few more generations. And that is something, answer will rest on the resilience of the community for that. So I think when a human dimension comes into the entire debate, these impacts does have catastrophic implications on lives and livelihood. In natural processes, I don't really see the community shift is a part and parcel. In fact, because of the shift, we have so much of diversity. Otherwise, we would have got all stagnant, species assemblage and limited number of species. It's because it's shifting from A to B, B to C, C to D, and A to D, A to whatever may be the combination. We have such a huge dynamic and rich flora and fauna in this ecosystem. When you are trying to do community intervention for conservation, taking this science to the community in a language they understand and to relate that to the traditional knowledge, therefore becomes very, very important. We cannot build the principles of conservation on unscientific and non-scientific ways. That's a small and simple message I want to end up with. But thank you very much, and I hope you enjoyed this process of learning and unlearning for us on Agatti Conservation Reserve. And thank you for this lovely, lovely, lovely people of islands, Lakshadweep Islands, which I call my second home. And they also proudly call me as part of their families, since I've been going there for so long. Thank you very much.